Crimean War, Part 2. Into the Valley of Death. Balaclava, 1854. The dawn of the 25th of October, 1854, was heavy with silence. The Crimean hills lay cloaked in mist, the vineyards dripping with dew. Horses shifted nervously in their lines, stamping at the cold ground, their breath curling into the morning air. Somewhere in the distance a cock crowed. A dog barked. The valley seemed almost peaceful. But it was the calm before a storm. The Allied armies, British, French, and their Ottoman partners, lay stretched between the fortress of Sevastopol and the small supply port of Balaclava. The siege of Sevastopol had dragged on for weeks, consuming men and material in its endless grind. But behind the siege lines, the lifeline of the Allies was vulnerable. Their supplies, food, ammunition, forage, flowed through Balaclava, a small harbour ringed by low hills and farmland. If the Russians could seize it, the entire Allied position might collapse. And Prince Menshikov intended to do just that. In the grey half-light of dawn, the Russian army stirred. General Liprandi commanded 25,000 men, supported by more than 70 guns. Columns of infantry, wrapped in greatcoats against the chill, moved silently through the fog. Cossack cavalry trotted at their flanks, their lances upright like a forest of steel. The rumble of artillery wheels carried across the damp air, mingling with the distant cries of officers. Their orders were clear. Advance on the redoubts that guarded the approaches to Balaclava. Smash through the thin Allied line. Drive hard for the port. If Balaclava fell, the Allies would be cut off from their supplies, their siege would falter, and the Black Sea would echo with Russian triumph. For the men of the Allied garrison, the morning began with uneasy watchfulness. British pickets reported movement in the mist. The Turks manning the redoubts gripped their muskets tighter, peering into the fog. They were brave men, but ill-equipped. Most carried smoothbore muskets that belched smoke and ball at close range, weapons more suited to a bygone age. Their earthworks were hastily built, low banks of soil and timber, vulnerable to concentrated fire. When the first rumble of Russian guns rolled across the valley, the Turks knew their trial had come. The redoubts were 6 in number, strung like beads along the causeway heights, a chain of low earthworks designed to shield the road into Balaclava. Each was manned by a handful of Turkish infantry and a scattering of British gunners, their uniforms stark against the pale soil. The Russians opened their bombardment with ferocity. Shot and shell slammed into the parapets, tearing gaps in the earth, throwing men backwards in bloody ruin. The Turks replied bravely, firing their old muskets, smoke puffing into the chill air. British artillery crews rammed charges into their guns, loosing thunderous blasts that tore lanes through the advancing Russian columns. But the weight of numbers was too great. For every Russian struck down, more surged forward. Their ranks seemed endless, grey coats disappearing into the fog, only to re-emerge closer still. In the first redoubt, Turkish defenders fought until their powder was gone. Russians swarmed over the walls, bayonets flashing. The few survivors fell back to the next position, stumbling across vineyards, the cries of their comrades echoing behind them. One redoubt after another fell. The second was overrun in a storm of steel. Defenders cut down at their posts. The third held longer, its British guns belching flame, Turkish muskets cracking until the barrels grew too hot to hold. But Russian artillery pounded the earthworks, splintering timber, blasting gaps wide. At last, infantry surged in with cold steel, and the parapet was taken. From his vantage point on the Sapun Heights, Lord Raglan watched the disaster unfold through his telescope. Smoke wreathed the causeway heights. Russian banners rose above the captured redoubts. The line had buckled, and the road to Balaclava gaped open. The port, the Allies' lifeline, hung in the balance. As the Russians pressed forward, the defenders scrambled to regroup. The Turks, bloodied but unbroken, fell back towards the town, their officers struggling to rally them amid the chaos. British regulars from the 93rd Highlanders moved to form a last line of defence, and on the hillsides the cavalry waited, the Heavy Brigade and the Light Brigade, their horses stamping, their riders glancing nervously towards the enemy columns, massing in the mist. The stage was set for defiance, for moments that would be carved into legend. But for now, the valley belonged to the Russians. Their guns boomed, their columns advanced, their cavalry gathered like thunderclouds at the horizon. The Allies were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the brink of catastrophe. Nightmares of defeat pressed close. If Balaclava fell, the siege of Sevastopol might collapse with it. Britain and France would be humiliated, their armies stranded, their fleets in jeopardy. The Ottoman Empire, their fragile ally, might crumble under Russian pressure. And yet, in the fog and fire of that October morning, ordinary soldiers prepared to stand. A few hundred Highlanders against thousands of cavalry, a handful of dragoons against a horde, the thin red line, the Heavy Brigade, and later, the Light Brigade. Balaclava was about to etch its name into history. The smoke of captured redoubts drifted over the valley like torn banners, and through that haze the Russians prepared their next thrust. Cavalry. Columns of horsemen gathered on the flanks, thousands strong. Lances caught the morning light, pennons fluttering in the breeze. The ground trembled with the slow roll of hooves. From their vantage point, Allied observers could see the movement, grey shapes shifting through the mist, swelling into dark waves ready to break. If the Russians swept down unchecked, nothing stood between them and Balaclava but a threadbare line of defenders. That line was the 93rd Highlanders, barely 500 men, drawn from the hills and glens of Scotland, clad in dark tartan kilts and scarlet tunics. They had been stationed near the road to the port, supported by a handful of Turkish infantry and a couple of field guns. It was not enough. Against them advanced Russian cavalry, several thousand strong, a host that seemed certain to crush them under sheer weight of horse and steel. Colonel Colin Campbell, their commander, was a seasoned soldier with hard lines on his face and iron in his voice. He had fought across the Empire, India, China, Afghanistan. He knew what it meant to face cavalry and what the textbooks prescribed. Infantry should form square, bristling bayonets outward, a hedge of steel that no horse would dare charge. But Campbell had no time and not enough men. A square would be swallowed whole. Instead, he gave his order. "Remember, men, there is no retreat from here. You must die where you stand." And then he formed them into a line, 2 ranks deep, 500 men stretched across the valley floor, standing between Balaclava and ruin. The Russian cavalry began their advance. Trumpets blared, hooves thundered, sabres flashed. The ground shook as thousands of horsemen moved into a canter, then a gallop. From a distance, it looked like an avalanche of grey, pouring down upon a sliver of red and tartan. The Highlanders waited, muskets levelled, bayonets fixed, their hearts hammered in their chests, but their hands were steady. Officers barked reminders in firm voices. "Wait for it! Wait!" The Russians closed the distance. 200 yards, 150. The cries of the riders rang out. The very air seemed to quiver with the force of the charge. At 100 yards, Campbell gave the order. The Highlanders unleashed a volley. The impact was devastating. Minier rifles cracked in unison, a wall of flame and smoke leaping from the line. Bullets tore through the first ranks of horsemen, saddles emptied, horses tumbled, riders pitched screaming to the ground. The line reloaded with practice speed, ramrods flashing, another volley. More Russians fell, horses rearing in terror, the charge faltering. A third volley hammered home, smoke rolling thick across the field. The cavalry wheeled away. They had charged straight at a line that should have shattered, but it had not moved an inch. From his place on the heights, William Howard Russell, correspondent of the Times, scribbled furiously in his notebook. He would later write words that became immortal. A thin red streak tipped with a line of steel, the thin red line. 500 Highlanders had stopped thousands, not by miracle, by discipline, courage and firepower, but the danger was far from over. Elsewhere in the valley, Russian cavalry massed again, this time aiming to roll up the British left. Against them stood the Heavy Brigade, commanded by General Scarlett. The Heavy Brigade were giants of men on giant horses, the Scots Greys, the Inniskilling Dragoons, the Royals, the Horse Guards. Their armour gleamed, their helmets plumed, their sabres polished to a mirror shine. They were meant for shock action, to smash an enemy already wavering, but now they would be called to attack uphill, into a force far larger than their own. Scarlett did not hesitate. The Russian cavalry, 10 squadrons, thousands of men, came sweeping down the slope, lances gleaming, a tidal wave of horseflesh. They outnumbered the British nearly 3-1. By all logic, the heavies should have waited, sought cover, avoided the clash. Instead, Scarlett gave the order. Trumpets rang out, spurs dug in. The Heavy Brigade advanced at a trot, then a canter, then full thunderous gallop, sabres raised, voices lifted in a great roar. The charge uphill seemed madness, but the sight was terrible and magnificent. Huge horses, their coats flecked with foam, thundering forward, riders leaning low in the saddle, blades ready. The two forces met with a crash that shook the valley. Sabres slashed, lances thrust. Men cried out, voices lost in the thunder of hooves. Horses screamed, colliding chest to chest, some rearing, some collapsing in bloody heaps. The fight was a blur of flashing steel and heaving bodies. The heavies, though outnumbered, fought like demons. Their size, their weight, their discipline gave them the edge. Scarlett himself rode at the front, sabre swinging, cutting down foe after foe. Around him the dragoons hacked and thrust, their horses driving deep into the Russian mass. At first the Russians enveloped them, grey coats pressing from all sides, but the heavies pressed harder, their squadrons pushed inward, tearing gaps, breaking cohesion. Sabres found their mark, lances snapped, men were dragged from saddles. Within minutes the impossible had happened. The Russian cavalry began to give way. What had seemed a certain triumph turned into chaos. The great mass recoiled, shattering into retreat. The Heavy Brigade had driven them back. The valley echoed with the cries of the wounded and the clash of steel. The Highlanders still stood firm on the plain, their line unbroken. The Heavy Brigade rode back to their positions, bloodied but triumphant. The Russians, stunned, regrouped beyond musket range. 2 miracles had been achieved in one morning. First, a thin red line had held against a wave of cavalry. Then an outnumbered brigade had charged uphill into a far larger force and sent it reeling. But as the dust settled, new danger stirred. On the heights, Lord Raglan peered through his telescope. He saw Russian soldiers dragging captured British guns from the abandoned redoubts. To him it was intolerable. Those guns, those cannon, symbols of national pride, must be retaken. He scribbled an order. Hasty, unclear, fateful. The scribbled order was given to Captain Louis Nolan, a fiery cavalry officer. The message, hastily worded, instructed the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns. And so the stage was set for the most infamous charge in British military history. Raglan meant the guns on the causeway heights. But from where the cavalry stood in the valley, those guns were hidden from view. The only visible batteries were the massed Russian cannon at the far end of the valley, flanked by more guns on both sides. When Nolan carried Raglan's words down, confusion reigned. Lord Lucan, commanding the cavalry division, read the order with disbelief. Which guns? Where? Nolan, impatient, gestured vaguely down the valley. Lord Cardigan, leading the Light Brigade, accepted the order without protest. And with that, the fate of 600 men was sealed. The Light Brigade assembled. 5 regiments of cavalry, the 13th Light Dragoons, the 17th Lancers, the 11th Hussars, the 8th Hussars, the 4th Light Dragoons. Sleek horses pawed at the ground, their breath steaming in the autumn air. Riders tightened straps, adjusted sabres, lowered lances. The sun glinted off polished helmets and breastplates. They looked magnificent, but every man knew the odds. At the far end of the valley, a mile and a half away, stood the Russian Grand Battery, scores of cannon waiting. On the ridges left and right, more batteries enfiladed the ground. To ride down that valley was to ride into a furnace of fire. Still the bugles called, the ranks dressed. The Light Brigade lowered its lances, and with a cry they began to move. The valley trembled under the thunder of hooves. 600 horsemen advanced at first in steady trot, sabres gleaming, pennons fluttering like flames. Trumpets rang out, echoing against the hills. Dust rose in clouds beneath them. From the heights, horrified observers looked on. One officer exclaimed, "My God, what do they mean to do? They are going to their destruction." The Russians could scarcely believe it either. From 3 sides their batteries opened fire. The valley erupted in smoke and flame. Round shot ploughed through the ranks, smashing men and horses alike. Shells burst overhead, iron fragments slashing through muscle and bone. The air filled with the thunder of guns, the screams of the dying, the shrill neighs of wounded horses collapsing mid-gallop. Still, the Light Brigade rode on. Gaps tore open in the line, saddles emptied, horses stumbled and pitched forward, hurling their riders to the ground. Men were flung aside like rag dolls, some rising again to limp desperately after their comrades, others trampled beneath pounding hooves. Captain Nolan, who had carried the fateful order, was among the first to fall. A shell burst overhead, a fragment tearing through his chest. He pitched from his saddle, dead before he struck the ground. But the brigade did not falter. The survivors pressed forward, spurring their horses through the storm. Sabres flashed, lances levelled. Dust and smoke swallowed them as they galloped ever deeper into the jaws of death. At last, the survivors reached the Russian battery. The gunners, astonished, fought desperately to defend their pieces. Some fired point blank, others swung rammers and sponges like clubs. But the Light Brigade crashed among them with steel. Lances skewered gunners, sabres slashed, horses trampled. The Russians broke, fleeing from their pieces. For a few glorious, chaotic minutes, the Light Brigade had done the impossible. They had taken the battery, but there was no one to support them. Surrounded, outnumbered, they were forced to retreat. And to retreat, they had to ride back through the same valley of fire. The return was worse than the advance. Russian cavalry swarmed the flanks, slashing at exhausted riders. Guns fired into their backs. Men reeled in the saddle, cut down, dragged screaming to the earth. Those who reached the British lines were battered, bloodied, scarcely believing they were alive. Of the nearly 700 who had begun the charge, fewer than 200 returned mounted. Horses lay in heaps along the valley. The ground was strewn with broken sabres, shattered lances, torn pennons. The valley itself seemed to groan under the weight of ruin. A French general, watching in awe, muttered, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre. It is magnificent, but it is not war." The field fell silent. Smoke drifted in tatters. Survivors sat slumped in their saddles, faces blackened with powder, eyes hollow. Wounded men dragged themselves from the carnage, stumbling back to the lines. The surgeons' tents filled within minutes, knives and saws working ceaselessly, blood soaking the ground outside. Lord Raglan, stricken, realised what his vague order had unleashed. Lord Lucan and Lord Cardigan, consumed with blame and bitterness, would feud for years over who was responsible. For the men who had ridden, there was no question. They had been sent into the valley of death by confusion, arrogance, and pride. But they had ridden nonetheless. News of the charge swept across Europe like wildfire. William Howard Russell of the Times wrote his dispatches in vivid prose, describing the splendour, the horror, the futility. Readers in London wept and raged. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, inspired by Russell's words, set pen to paper and gave the world lines that would never be forgotten. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. The charge of the Light Brigade became myth in its own time. A story of blind obedience, reckless courage, and the terrible price of blunder. And yet Balaclava was not simply the charge. The day had also given the world the thin red line, where a handful of Highlanders had stood against thousands. It had seen the Heavy Brigade triumph against impossible odds. These too were part of the story. Balaclava was a mosaic of steadfastness, daring, and tragedy. Strategically, the battle was inconclusive. The Russians had captured the redoubts, but Balaclava itself had not fallen. The siege of Sevastopol continued. But for soldiers and civilians alike, what lingered was not the map. It was the memory. The sight of men riding knowingly into death, and the echo of muskets holding firm against the tide. The legacy of Balaclava was complex. It revealed the flaws of Allied command, vague orders, bitter rivalries, failures of communication that cost lives. It showed how quickly heroism could curdle into waste when strategy faltered, but it also revealed something enduring about courage, that men, when ordered, when bound by discipline and comradeship, will ride into fire, though they know the odds. They will stand in a thin red line against overwhelming force, and they will not break. In that valley, on that October morning, the world glimpsed both the nobility and the futility of war. A paradox that would echo down the generations. Balaclava did not decide the Crimean War, but it decided how the war would be remembered, not in terms of forts captured or ground held, but in terms of legend. The thin red line, the Heavy Brigade, the Light Brigade. Words that still carry weight, spoken with awe and sorrow. For those who survived, the memory never left. The sound of hooves thundering through smoke, the blast of guns from three sides, the cries of men cut down beside them, the valley of death that haunted their dreams. Yet the war did not pause. The Russians, stung by their failure to seize Balaclava, gathered their strength for another blow. Days later, in the choking fog of November, they hurled 40,000 men against the thin British lines at Inkerman. What followed was not a set-piece battle, but a savage struggle in the mist. A soldier's battle, fought hand to hand. Join us again for the next episode of this series, retelling the Crimean War, as we step into the fog of Inkerman. A brutal clash where confusion reigned and courage alone kept the line from breaking. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.